get started, if you can give me your name for the record.
Hi, I'm Elliott Goldstein. I was born here in Atlanta. My father was a lawyer here, and I went to law school at Yale, and then, as he did, came back here with the same firm that he had been a part of. And in 1940, they had a draft, and I looked on there, and I was a winner at a very low number. That's good for license plates, but wasn't so good for the draft. In any event, I decided to get my year over with and get back to practicing law. Well, I had somebody from the judge advocate's office come over and ask me if I'd go with them. I could stay in Atlanta, and they'd give me a sergeant's stripes, and I wouldn't have to work but half a day. And I said, no, I'm Jewish, and this is my war, and I don't want to do that. So I got my wish. I went in and I joined the National Guard as a private, and I had had some military training, and pretty quickly got promoted to sergeant. And then our armory burned down, and we were delayed on being inducted. So instead of being inducted in 41, we didn't get inducted till 42. By that time, we'd been converted. This was the 122nd Infantry. We'd been converted to the 179th Field Artillery. So we had a quick course in general military things, and when we were inducted, I, along with several others, was commissioned as second lieutenant. That was 1941.
What month?
February of 41. So we went down to Camp Blanding, Florida, with 6 officers sleeping in a pyramidal tent, and no quarters allowance. And it was pretty good. I did have one person who taught me how to be an officer. We had a maneuver, and Elliott Tuttle, who was a lawyer who I knew, later became a general, and later became, was in Congress. I'm not in Congress, in the Treasury Department, and a very, very wonderful man. We were having a maneuver, and I was told, he told me I want to be the battery up to the next position, and I want wire communication to everything at the time they go up. And so I started telling him how difficult it was to do that. I had to do this, and he said, Elliott, I don't want to know how hard it is. If I knew how hard it is, I wouldn't tell you to do it. I just want you to do it. And I said, yes, sir. And that was the best lesson I got in the Army, one of the best. So from that time on, I never said anything was too hard. You just do it. Then I went on to, after the war broke after the Pearl Harbor, I got ordered out, no, before Pearl Harbor, I got ordered out to Fort Sill to take the battery officers course. I finished that and came back, and when I came back, the war was on, and shortly I was ordered out to Fort Sill as an instructor. Well, I got there and gave them my same song and dance, that I didn't want to be there, I wanted to be in combat, and I didn't want to teach. So they said, fine, wait 6 months, and if you're not happy, we'll let you go wherever you want to go. And I was so foolish, so idealistic, I didn't know that I was insulting everybody there. So I knew later I knew they were going to get me. So anyway, at the end of 6 months, I came in. 6 months where I had gone from a pyramidal tent with 5 other lieutenants to officers' quarters between the officers' clubs on one side, the nurses' quarters on the other side, paradise for a single lieutenant. They had West Pointer and I shared quarters. He had a separate bedroom. I had a separate bedroom. We had a bath. We had a little kitchenette. We had a living room. And you couldn't ask any better in the Army anywhere, because this was regular Army. So at the end of my 6 months, I had made arrangements to go to Fort Lewis, Washington with a mountain division. So they sent me to Camp Forest, Tennessee with an infantry division. So they got even. I went to the 80th Division there, and I did well. I'd been promoted to first lieutenant, got married, and then there was times they're trying to get us ready to go overseas. So there was a lot of nighttime maneuvers at night. And General Lear would keep us all on the post, and I'd come in and see my wife, and I'd have to go out and spend the night on the post. And while I was gone, some drunken soldier broke into our apartment. And my wife woke up. He was at the foot of the bed striking matches, and she started screaming, and she ran out. And we were in an apartment that had originally been a house. She ran up the stairs and pounded on the door, and they thought just another soldier's wife having a fight with her husband. They wouldn't pay any attention to her. And so when I got back and she told me what had happened, I put her on the plane for Atlanta and put in for transfer. So I transferred to the 106th Division, which was being in the process of being formed. And we went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and I served there, and eventually we had our troops were in good shape, and they had some big losses in the Urchin Forest, and they just pulled all our people away from us. So we had to train them all over again. So they pulled all these young men who had signed up for also training out of college. So we got some really great men who really hadn't signed up for this sort of thing, but they were good soldiers. One of the things that impressed me at the time was I was giving a lecture. By that time I was a captain at a battery, giving a lecture on what to expect when you're overseas, and I could see their eyes were glazing over. And I said, how many of you think you're going overseas? And a few. And I said, how many think you're going to get wounded or killed? And nobody. Well, it wasn't too long that they learned what life was really like. In any event, we eventually shipped out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, and went over to England. We were in a British camp there, and it was my first taste of dealing with the Brits. We had a pretty nice billets there. It was a regimental camp, but we had some plumbing trouble, and we got the camp maintenance men, and they came over and said, oh yes, we see it, Governor. And they pulled out a what do you call them, pulled out some to heat the pipes, the burner, torch, and they proceeded to make tea. And I said, good God, we need the plumbing fixed, and you're making tea. I don't see how in the world Hitler didn't just run right over you. And they said, Governor, he never tried. So we went through that and went overseas, and we went over in on ships and combat loaded, which meant that we had all our trucks and all our food and all our ammunition, everything was on there. So the sailors got some of my soldiers that were supposed to be on guard into a dice game, and they proceeded to take away all the food. We didn't know that. So they dumped us at Cherbourg, and off we got and we were flying across France. We stopped to have dinner, and we opened up our kitchen trucks, all gone. Those guys, by the time they were back in London, had sold it on the black market. So that was our introduction to European theater.
What was the month and year that you went on
That-
shore at Cherbourg?
We went ashore and this was in September of 44. And we went straight across to our position. And we went into position in the place of the 9th Division. And they had stopped just when they got to the Siegfried line. And they had been going cross country because it was summertime when they went up there. It was now winter. We were told to go in hole for hole and gun for gun, which meant that we had to just go back where they were. Only trouble about that, all that going into position, was that they were able to travel across the hills, and you could drive after all that snow came in. You had to stay pretty much on the roads. So the Germans weren't thinking of coming the way they did before. They were going to come down the roads. After we'd been there a few days, we sort of realized that this was not a good place to be. But they told us, well, the Germans are not coming this way. We expect them to come to the north. So I was out on, by that time, well, I had something happen to me before I got there. When I was in Fort Jackson, our original battalion commander was a regular Army guy who had been in Panama, and obviously they'd just put him somewhere where he couldn't do any harm. Well, he was an nincompoop, and the battalion was really going to hell because we had no discipline. And a fellow named Payne Kelly, who was a lawyer in Tampa, was sent down there to inspect us. He got all the officers together and said, now, if you got an order from your commanding officer, you didn't agree with it, you thought it was wrong, would you follow it? And I said, oh shit, this is it. In the Army, you don't say, you just say, yes, sir. And on the other hand, I knew that this was a bad situation, so I said, well, I can take my chances. I said, no, he's a nice man, but I couldn't do it because I don't think he's competent. So he gave me a piercing look, and I said, I've done it now. Well, it turned out he promoted me to major and became the executive officer of the battalion. When we went overseas, after we went up to this position, we looked around to see where we were. I was on sort of a little reconnaissance to see what was around us, and went down to the road and then over the next, the adjoining area, and a armored car rolls up, and a friend of mine from Atlanta, John Franklin, was a lieutenant in charge of it. So we stopped, and he said, Elliott, said, we've got one little company here to cover 9 miles, and said the only thing we can do if the Germans come through here is to report it and run, and that's why we have rubber tires on them. So I went back and told Payne Kelly, I said, we're in tough shape. He said, yeah, but they tell us not to worry. Well, we had forward observers up, and they started telling us that all sorts of things going on the other side. You hear trucks moving, guns moving, lights on. So I called up to our artillery S3, or G3 for him, and told him what was happening. And he called up to Corps and told them what was happening. They said, "Don't worry, that's just a separate subterfuge." He said, "I told them this is where the Germans have always come. In 3 different campaigns, they've come right through here. And this is in all their books, and this is what they'll do." They said, "You're just green, you haven't been in combat, you don't know what's going on." So he said, "I'm sorry, I've done my best." Well, it got worse. So we hear more and more noise. Next morning, they start dropping shells into our area. And none of them came anywhere near me. But so I took several men and an aiming circle and went out to do a shell report. That's where you can take a look at where the shells came in and see the direction from which they came. And you put your aiming circle up there and see the direction that is, and then take another one nearby and see where it came from, and where those 2 lines intersect is where the gun is that was shooting at you. So I got all that information down, and bam, here's somebody shooting at us with rifles. I look up, here's some Germans in white uniforms, scouts on skis. They come in there scouting to see what we're doing. And so they started popping at us, and we popped back at them. I went back and I told the battalion commander, Payne Kelly, we got real troubles. Next thing I know, I put 2 guys with bazookas out on either side. We were right on the road, because I figured the Germans were going to come down that, and sure enough they did. But we had one gun that was pointing straight at the road, so we had that. So the sergeant on that gun got it, and he hit one of the armored cars, small tanks. And the people got out, and the fellow that was on my left had the bazooka, pulled his bazooka up, and he did a very foolish thing. He stood up and fired it, and killed the man who was up there. But he was a perfect target, so he was dead. So I didn't have any other bazookas, so I decided I'd go over and get it. Well, it was fortunately for me, it was a very, very muddy period because we had all that snow, but trucks had gone through there and they dug deep ruts getting through that snow into the mud. So I go to pick up the bazooka, and bam, somebody drops a shell short of me. So I crawled into that truck rut, and I get in there, and what am I looking at? The arm of the guy that was killed, and that's in my eyes, and the bazooka's there. So then there's another shell hit on the other side. One was short, one was long. Well, in the artillery, the way you get your target is you get a long and a short, and then you split the difference and see where that is, and then if that's real close, you fire for effect. So I knew it was just a question of time before they got me. So all I could do was lie there in that truck rut and pray. Well, they fired for effect, and they were short, and there was enough soft ground that the rounds went into the ground and exploded without hurting me. So I crawled back out of there with the bazooka, went back to our headquarters, went upstairs, helped direct fire against the people that were attacking us, then went down, and that's where I got the famous line. One of my lieutenants, when I was a captain of A Battery, played football at Yale, and he was a lawyer and a very great guy, big man. And he was going out and was helping somebody that was shot in his battery, and he got shot in the shoulder. So they put him on a gurney, and they was getting ready to take him back to the medical people. And I said, "How are you, Ted?" He said, "Coach, they're playing too rough out there. I'm turning in my jock strap." I said, "Okay, lots of luck," and I saw him later in the war. So it got worse from there. We were told to move back to an area further back so the infantry could withdraw towards us. Kelly went up to the infantry, and I was supposed to go back and select the area where we were supposed to go. I went back and took a couple of scouts with me. They commenced going into position in that place. And all of a sudden we got somebody coming flying down to see us. Germans are right behind me. "You better get out of here." So I told them to get out. And we had a message center at the end of the road just before a river. And so I went down there to tell them we were moving because we had no communication where we were. And they followed me. Most of them got through. We lost a few. When I tried to report in, there were no wires. They'd all been cut. So I went over to the other side. We got on the other side, and we had a few guns. We had 3 guns in, and we were waiting to see what we were supposed to do next. We look over to our right, and we see where the Germans are setting fire to a barn just to get a light in there. So,
Actually, let me ask you this so we can help set the stage. Tell me just a little bit about the number of guns, the type of guns, and the number of men you had in your battalion.
well, the battalion was a 105 millimeter battalion. It had 3 batteries. Each battery has 4 guns. In addition to that, you have some machine guns just for protection, and men have rifles. We also have a service battery that provides you with ammunition, food, and that sort of thing, and mechanics. And you have a headquarters battery that has a fire direction center and surveyors and communications people. Each battery has its own communications people. So that's generally the way they're set up.
And y'all were completely mechanized, right? You had
We
trucks to tow the guns,
had
trucks
trucks.
to haul the people.
Right. They in the 106th Division, there were 3 artillery battalions that were 105 guns, 105 howitzers actually, and there's 1 battalion of memory as we had howitzers. They're 150 millimeter guns, I believe. I've forgotten that. In any event, the commanding officer of that battalion, when the fighting started, pulled out and got his whole battalion across the bridge and out of that, which was a smart thing to do. We didn't do that, and Kelly went up to report to the infantry, and eventually, when they surrendered, he was forced to surrender, so he was gone. We had 3 guns left when we came across the bridge. They had blown 1 set of guns, and one set got mired down somewhere. So after we were in that position, we were waiting for orders, and they told us where to go. And we started around. We started down into Luxembourg, came back up. Then I see a Jeep coming along with a Jeep in front, a Jeep in back. It's a general. And he said, who's in charge of these guns? I am, sir. He said, get them off the road. So I said, push them in the ditch. Well, we said, yes, sir. And he didn't know how important those guns were going to be to him. Anyway, we got them out, and we eventually wound up at a crossroads called Barak de Batur, the forest barracks. And Arthur Parker was senior to me. He was the S3, but he was older than me. He was a veteran of the CCC. That was Civilian Conservation Corps. He'd graduated from Auburn. He was at good engineering training, but he was unfortunate enough to graduate into a depression, and a lot of those engineers had that experience. So he had gone into the service just to make a living. So Arthur was a senior, and he was a commanding officer. We wound up at the final destination, and we looked around, and the orders that Arthur got were that we should set up there to protect the rear of what was left of the division artillery, which was ahead of us, behind us now. So we said, all right, we got a bulldozer there. We dug some holes for the guns. We had one pointing in one direction, one we had them pointing in three directions. And so then we waited, and soon enough we found out. We didn't know it, we were on the axis of advance of a German army. And there was first it was a Volks, what they call them? Volkssturm, I guess.
Oh, the sort of young boy, old man militia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was first, and they were followed by SSS. SS. Gave him too many S's. Can I have some water?
Oh yes, absolutely. We've got a glass. Let me pause this, and I'll let him.
All right. One of the things we did was we laid out some landmines across the road from the direction the Germans were coming. They would be coming from the east. And we had holes dug on all the roads leading in there, so that we had, and they had communication back. Well, middle of the night, they called back and say, I hear noises, people are coming. And then they said there were some Germans, and they're looking at the mines. So Captain Arthur Brown, who had been in my battery when he was a lieutenant, and I taught him at Field Artillery School, said, what I want you to do is stay low, come on back, and then when you're back, just stay out of the way. So he gave orders to just fire straight down that road. So a lot of Germans got killed right there. So that was a little relief, but it was only temporary. We had a series of attacks, and we had the men that were in that battery plus others who had joined us. And then we had, later we had some infantry that came in there. I had made it a practice. We had Barak de Batur had two houses that we used for headquarters. And I would go from one to the other and go to each of the guns to be sure everything was all right. And it was kind of hazardous. In any event, I just realized that what happens in combat is you get really exhilarated. The adrenaline starts to flow. When the enemy starts getting close and you know that's going to happen, you hear everybody's urinating. It's just a reflex, and they're ready. If you're not courageous, if you're going to hide, you're going to get killed. So anyway, either that or you're just going to hide in a hole, and that happens. Some people will not fire a gun. They won't do anything. They're paralyzed. I felt the only way for me to keep everybody activated was to show them that I wasn't worried. So I would get up in the daytime and tell the Germans to go to hell. Crazy. But everybody else was figured if he can do it, if he's not afraid, I'm not afraid. They called, we had some Germans to try to slip in behind us down a ditch, and they were all there when they told me that. I went over there, we held guns on them, and I told them in German, Achtung, kommen Sie hier mit Handeho, except I had a better voice then than I do now, and they all jumped up and held their hands up, and the men were just amazed that they would react that way, but I knew they would. It's a German. So got rid of it.
Were you fluent in German, or had you just learned certain phrases?
Just picked it up. This was one I needed to know. So we had several engagements with the Germans, and they kept getting more and more around us. They sent the 101st Airborne down there, and they had some of their sergeants came down. I got them to do some patrolling for me to see what the Germans were doing. They didn't have any good news for me, and the glider infantry were there, and they sent them down, so they were in the same place we were. So we had a lot of firepower there, but there was a lot of firepower came up against us. Arthur Parker, then we got orders when the 82nd came in there, that we should pull out. And so that was fine. And Arthur did something that was very crazy. He held a conference between all of us, the infantry and us, out in the open where the Germans could see us in a circle. So they dropped a mortar right in the middle of it. They hit him, he went to the hospital. Hit me, I went head over heels into a ditch. And but I had so much clothing on that it went through my jacket and first layer of underwear and burned the second layer of underwear, but never hit the skin. That was unfortunate for me, because if I'd gotten it, I would have got a Purple Heart, and I would have been home 6 months sooner. So that's just part of how I was getting paid back for one combat. So anyway, eventually we had a couple of Germans come in and a flag to tell us to surrender. I wasn't going to do that. So
at this point, since Parker got wounded, were you in command?
yeah. So I put him in a Jeep, and we went up to the next command, which was an armored force command, about 5 miles up. And I asked wouldn't somebody ride shotgun for me? They said no, and they later said, we never thought you'd get through there alive. But anyway, I got up there and told them what the situation was, and you could see these were SS. So they sent another major, Armored Force major, with me to come back to see what we could do, that they could bring people in to help us. We started the way back, and shots were coming straight up the road. So we got into the woods and walked as far as we could in the woods, and we could see this big battle going on. The Germans had not yet overrun them, but our people were escaping. So that was the end of our service at Parker's Crossroads. But we'd held the Germans up for 3 days, and their whole strategy was to get through there and get up to the coast and cut off the supplies for the Americans. So those 3 days were extremely important. In my book, we have a quotation from the German general who was commanding that force. He said that he had been on the Russian front. He'd never been in any battle as bloody as one at Crossroads. So anyway, so those of us who got out went up, and we were sent over to a chateau south of Brussels, and to get pulled together, and eventually it was a very good duty. We had some very fine people. Countess D'Outremont and her daughter were there. The men had fled because the Germans would grab them and put them into a work camp. So they were very nice to us, and I wrote an after-action report, had what little we had together again, and then I was sent over to the 592nd, the 150 millimeter guns, and that was great duty. By that time, the Germans were being pushed back, so we were going back to where we started. The snow was melting. We got along there, and I came to one place where some of the infantry had surrendered, and they were lying there, the corpses, with their throat cut, their penises cut off and shoved in their mouth. And our troops got so angry that I had a hard time keeping them from killing prisoners, which they will do. So anyway, we got along, and then we got up to where it was just follow the infantry. We were in support of paratroopers. And I had the great privilege of being, it was the S3 of the 592nd, and I was executive, and I had command at night. The exec commands the artillery at night. The battalion commander commands it in the daytime. Everything is divided up, so everybody works 12 hours and is off 12 hours. We had, in support, we had the Corps artillery, which were 200 millimeter guns, and big guns, and lots of them. And I had with my firing group, the center that we have there, I could command them all. So I had privilege. They said we were like a TOT at 6 a.m. on this point, because they want us they want to attack right after that. So that was a great thrill to get all that firepower. Yeah, it was going on a cliff. It would have demolished it, I guess. About 10 minutes before that, I get a call. Call it off. The paratroopers climbed up the cliff, and they've already captured the place. Germans had pulled out. So I didn't get my chance to do that. But I got my chance to really do a lot of things in the artillery that I wasn't able to do before. So I had a good time and got a good report, and the battalion commander was a West Pointer. He tried to talk me into staying in the Army. And I said, why would I do that? He said, well, it's a wonderful life. He said, I'm on the Army polo team. I get up in the morning, I go out and get on my horse and ride around and see how the troops are doing. And then I come back. And then I see, have breakfast, see what's happening with the sergeants, putting the troops to work in different places. And then by noon I have my lunch, and then I go play polo. And he said, I go to Florida in the winter, I go to California in the fall, I go to Europe in the summertime and play polo. He said, you got to be a multimillionaire to live the way I do. He said, you ought to try it. I said, only one problem, I can't play polo. So that was the end of my Army career. I got out and went back and practiced law, and that was the end of my career. There's a lot more details that I could put in this, but they're all in a little book that I got together called On the Job Training. And if you want to know more, it's all in there.
Okay. Actually, I've got just a few detailed questions.
Sure.
If you don't mind me asking. At the beginning, you said that you were Jewish and you considered this my war. Would you mind elaborating on that just a little bit?
Well, Hitler was, what he was doing was murdering Jews. And if you wanted to get Hitler, I mean, if anybody had a reason to go after that administration, it had to be Jews. And I wasn't married at the time I went in. So it was logical for me to be one of the people. If anybody was going to take a bullet, it ought to be me.
Talking about...
Not that I wanted to do it.
Right. Speaking of not being married, and you said that you got married...
In 42.
In 42. I know that the environment of that time was very different than it is now. Tell me a little bit about the thoughts that you and your wife had, knowing that you were about to go overseas to war, but still deciding to get married.
Well, I guess we, like everybody else, we put it off, and we decided. It was actually over a year before I went overseas. I married in 42, and we actually went over in 44. So we decided to do it. But I wanted to have children, and she wouldn't do that. She didn't want to be left with babies.
You went in 41. So you were in service when Pearl Harbor was bombed. Tell me what you remember about that day and about your emotions and the emotions of your comrades.
Well, at that time, I was at Fort Sill at the Battery Officers School out there, the Field Artillery School, where, as a member of the cadre for the 106, and we were receiving additional training out there. And we had gone to a movie, and it came back. We were to the officers' quarters, and somebody said the Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor. And we said, oh, my goodness, and we said a lot of other things. This is it. And sure enough, it was. What?
I'm trying to think about how to phrase this. When during the war, when you were, as you said that it was Hitler and the Nazi Party and everything were killing Jews by the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. At the time, during the war, tell me how you felt about the Germans. Just personally.
I didn't care much for them. I just didn't like them at all. They were arrogant. The ones, the SS were just as arrogant as they could be, and yet they were pretty cowardly if you got them in a corner.
Have your feelings about the Germans changed?
Yeah, I've gotten along with them fine.
What about the?
I wouldn't go there for years though. But we went there. Harriet and I went there. We had a painting by an American artist who had lived in Germany and was a member of a German group of modern artists, and they had we lent one of the picture we had to a museum here, and they in turn lent it to a museum in Munich, and we went over to Munich for that show and then traveled around Germany. So.
The dropping of the atomic bomb has, in recent years, been controversial as to the whole reasons of it. Tell me about where you were when you heard it was dropped, and how you felt about it then and now.
Well, it was after the war ended. I was sent down to the now south of Rennes, the peninsula, I've forgotten the name of it, and to reconstitute. I was given the job of reconstituting the one of the infantry regiments, the 422nd. And after what I did was when I started off, I had a cadre of 35 officers and about 200 men for an infantry regiment, and they started shipping them in to me. 100 officers, 300 or 400 men every day. And every time they sent an officer that ranked me, I sent him down to one of the battalions. So every time somebody came through there who was a chef at a good restaurant in New York, I kept him for the officers' mess. We're in the middle of a section of France that's milk and honey. Where all the butter comes from, all the great food, good wines. So I was living real well. And I get a West Pointer shows up, Lieutenant Colonel, and I said goodbye. He finally ranked me, I'm out. So I got out of there and went back, and we were reconstituting our battalion, and I was back as executive officer, and I had a driver from Georgia who'd been a bootlegger, and we were driving along when the word came out that the bomb had been dropped and the Japanese had surrendered. So he said, well, I guess I ought to get a promotion. Everybody ought to go up one. not go up from private to private first class. I said, I don't think so. But anyway, it's a nice thought. But that was the only thing we had to say about it.
Just
After that, I went with the battalion up into Germany, and I didn't like being the executive officer. Parker was back; he was commanding it, and I really had enough. So one of the partners in the law firm, Charlie Reed, had been Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Georgia, and he was a friend of Roosevelt's. He got a commission as a lieutenant colonel in the judge advocates. So he was up in Berlin running the property control division, and he sent for me to come up there and be his assistant. Well, Charlie had become an alcoholic, so he wasn't around very much. So I was running things. And I got my second good lesson up there. I had a lot of officers that had been assigned up there. At that time, you couldn't go home until you had a certain number of points. And they took more points for a major than it did for a private. Most majors had children. I didn't have any children. So you got points for being overseas, points for how long you'd been in the Army, and points for decorations. But you got good points for children. I didn't have any. So I was stuck there. And it was kind of interesting, and I was used to telling people what to do, and I was treating them the same way. This group of officers that were assigned to me. Finally, I was sitting here like this, and door opens and knocks the door, and man salutes, and I return it. I said, at ease. He said, I have something to tell you that you ought to know. I said, what's that? He said, you're not as goddamn smart as you think you are. I said, that's a point well taken. Thanks. I never forgot it. The worst thing you can do is to show people how goddamn smart you are. So I carried that and Elbert Tuttle's advice all the way through, and these were the two great things I got out of the Army. Anyway, I got promoted to lieutenant colonel, came home, went back to practicing law, and that was it.
One question, and this is just for the record, and you don't have to answer it at all if you don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, and even can you, or can one, prepare themselves for combat?
Well, the system we used was that you first have to know, just by reflex, all the things you're going to have to do. You're going to have to know how to shoot, how to throw a grenade, and how to react quickly. Second thing you have to do is to realize that the worst thing you can do is to be afraid. So you should never get yourself locked up in a basement somewhere. Because if you do, you're going to be so afraid of what's outside that you'll never venture it. You've got to get out. The people that get hurt are not those who are driving out in combat. The ones that get hurt are the ones who are afraid and just stand still.
What in your experience was the worst thing about combat?
Well, the worst thing for me was the fact that I had to give orders that might result in somebody giving his life. And I had to do it. And that's the hardest thing for an officer. And that's why a lot of officers don't like to be where the troops are.
Just one last question. What do you want future generations of this country to know and understand and remember about the sacrifices your generation made during the war?
I don't really know, because it was an entirely different situation. We had, at that time, you didn't get into war unless Congress was going to back it. And today, we've had a situation where the executive officers can declare war, the presidents can declare war pretty much on their own. So I don't know how to answer that. It's not a situation where you really have the same feeling we had. Everybody felt he was in a war for a purpose. And we won the war, we felt we'd accomplished something. And we'd helped all of our fellow citizens back home. But I feel sorry for these fellows who are having to go into these battles today where there's no great support, and the president is careful to make certain that nobody has to make a sacrifice. When my wife's at home, she moved in with her parents. We had ration cards with tickets for food and for gasoline. She walked up to the streetcar a couple of blocks, went down to work at the center where they had women volunteers to show the airplanes that had a table show all the planes that were around the area and where they were and how they were moving. And she was making a sacrifice. I was making a sacrifice. And everybody else was. Not everyone, but most people were. Today, it's not so. Nobody is sacrificing. Some fellows are sacrificing their lives. And we're going to have an awful lot of people come out. Well, again, this is not popular. There's a lot of people going to come out of this war that were in the reserves or the National Guard. We're going to be really turned off. And I don't know what I could say to them, except you got yourself into it.
Is there anything we haven't covered or talked about that you would like to address?
Well, I think I've covered as much as I should.
Okay. All right.
Was that all right?
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
You want me to fill in something?